Today's discussion on Chapter 8 has to do with structuring organizations for today's challenges. If you remember back in Chapter 7, one of the four primary functions of management was organization. So we're going to talk a little bit more about organization with regards to the entire company. If you remember all the way back to Chapter 1, the title of that was The Changing Aspect of Business. And remember, businesses have to change all the time, otherwise they will go out of business. So as you can see from the slide here, many companies such as automakers, home builders, and banks have had to reorganize and even reorganize again. For instance, if you went to a bank 20 years ago, you would see 7 or 8 tellers at the bank. Today, you're lucky if you see 2. Oftentimes, there is 1. Banks have got you now doing most of your banking either at an ATM machine or through their online website. So, adjusting to changing markets is the new norm within capitalistic economies. So how is an organization structured? Well, each organization is going to be structured differently, but all organizations, no matter how they're structured, should, one, create a division of labor, which says that certain employees should do certain tasks. So for instance, going back to In-N-Out, an example that we used last chapter, someone here is going to be working the front register, while other employees are going to be cooks, and other employees will be doing janitorial work. In addition, oftentimes teams or departments are set up. It could be departments such as the accounting department or the finance department. Then resources, whether human resources or other resources, are allocated, such as capital or materials. And you can see some of the other ways to structure an organization. And again, Chapter 1 talks about the changing business environment, and here listed are several reasons why businesses must change. One of the foremost reasons is more global competition. Because factors of production that we learned about in Chapter 1 are much lower in developing countries, and with more faster technological changes, you can also see almost anyone can make anything at any time from anywhere. Oftentimes, when the economy is in decline, it forces changes. Usually, there's less profits to go around and expenses have to be cut. Oftentimes, that is humans through layoffs. Finally, we look at pressure to protect the environment. Companies are becoming more sustainable, which means they are consciously trying to find ways to lower their carbon footprint in terms of making sure that, for instance, paper straws or recyclable paper or napkins. But really, the biggest thing driving the change beyond those issues that I just brought up is you, the consumer, have also changed. Customers today want and really expect products that are high quality, that get to them fast, with friendly service, and all at a great to low cost. If you can't provide that, the consumer is smart and nimble to go out and find someone who will. Think about all the change that has happened just in the last 20 years. I really wish we would have another slide here that shows that 2020, but just look from 20 years ago in 2000 to just 10 years ago in 2010. How much things can change in a decade. So look at, like, for instance, the amount of reality TV shows from 4 to 320, so the huge increase. However, look at the decrease in terms of number of daily letters mailed from 207 billion down to 175 billion. I would imagine that number has decreased a lot even since then. One of the themes that we'll talk about a lot today, so I want to introduce it now, is the notion of economies of scale. And this is where companies can reduce their cost of making goods or providing services by buying materials in bulk. And the idea behind this is that the average cost for goods decreases as the more your production level rises. That gives inherent advantages to bigger companies. So in the retail space, Walmart will have an advantage based on its economies of scale over a mom and pop grocery store. The next couple of slides, we want to look at some classic economists and their sort of rudimentary approaches to organizing a company. First, I want to look at Henry Fayol, and let's look at some of his principles. Henry Fayol was a French economist, and he was really known as the father of rigidness. And if you look at some of his principles here, we're not going to go through them all, but I do want to touch on a few of them. For instance, unity of command, the idea that an employee reports to one and only one boss, such as a thing as division of labor. So someone specializes in one thing and one thing only. Authority. Again, the boss always has authority over the employee. The degree of centralization, which means major decisions are made at centralized headquarters. And finally, I want to talk about the final two, equity and esprit de corps. Equity means that the manager should treat his or her employees with respect and justice. And then the overall arching thing is esprit de corps, a spirit of pride and loyalty to the company over the interests of the individual. You can see a picture here of Henry Fayol. So he believed that organizations where employees have no more than one boss, the lines of authority are clear. If an employee had a problem, he or she would only go to his or her immediate supervisor. Thus, this organization would be very rigid and not flexible. And generally speaking, rigid organizations don't respond to customer complaints quickly. Now, a disciple of Henry Fayol was Henry Weber. It looks like Weber, but it's pronounced Weber. Max Weber sort of piggybacked off the approach of Henry Fayol, but in addition, he wanted to emphasize descriptions of jobs and the codification or writing down of such things as rules, guidelines, and records, procedures, policies, and procedures. So in essence, Max Weber was taking the original principles of Henry Fayol and adding on to them. I'm going to introduce to you three terms upcoming that all relate to each other. The first two can be found on this slide, and the last one will be found on the subsequent slide. So when following the principles of Henry Fayol and Max Weber, managers in essence control their workers. They do it through a system known as a hierarchy. As you can see, a hierarchy is a system in which one person is at the top of the company, and thus then there is a ranked order, sequential order from top down. The hierarchy can be demonstrated through the line of authority known as a chain of command, and that's the line of authority that moves from the top of the hierarchy, the person at the top, to its lowest level. The chain of command then can be visually represented through an organizational chart. In an organizational chart, first thing you should know is it's a visual device that shows the relationships among the people within the organization, and it divides the company's work. In essence, it shows who reports to who. So the best way I would like to show this is the hierarchy is the overall system from top down. The top to the bottom goes through what's called a line of authority known as chain of command. And the chain of command can be visually shown through an organizational chart. This is an example of a typical organizational chart. Notice that one of the people at the very bottom, if following through with Fail and Weber, he or she would report only a problem to his or her immediate boss, which would be a first line supervisor. That person should never break the chain of command as shown through the organizational chart of the overall hierarchy. So that person should never report to a manager, either A, B, or C, and most definitely should not report a problem to the president. Everything goes through the chain of command in the hierarchy. In essence, one of the downfalls of Henry Fail and Max Weber was the notion of a bureaucracy. And a bureaucracy is a company that has many layers of managers, a lot of managers who set rules and regulations and as well as oversee all decisions. Because certain companies have such a big amount of bureaucracy, it can take weeks, sometimes even months, sometimes years to have information passed down to lower level employees. The book points out that the pharmaceutical giant Pfizer has 17 layers of managers between the CEO and the lowest level employee. That just seems like too much. Because of this and the long decision-making process, bureaucracies oftentimes will annoy a company's customers. Let's take a little bit of time to look at where decisions should be made. And let's look at the difference between authority that is centralized and authority that is decentralized. Centralized authority is when decision making is concentrated at the top levels of management, usually at corporate headquarters. So big decisions are made at corporate headquarters and then pushed down the bureaucracy to lower level managers and then employees. The opposite is known as decentralized authority. With decentralized authority, decision making is not made at the top, but rather is delegated down to lower level managers and employees who are on the ground and thus are more familiar with the actual local conditions than centralized headquarters is. This really is the essence of empowerment that we've talked about in previous chapters. Next, let's talk about span of control. Span of control is the optimal number of subordinates, not the total number, but rather the optimal number of subordinates that a manager should supervise. Thus, when work is standardized, which means all the lower level employees are doing the same or similar type of work, you may have a broad span of control. That's possible. However, when the work is much more specialized as opposed to standardized, the span of control should narrow. In addition, span of control generally narrows at higher levels of the organization. The modern approach today is to reduce and or eliminate middle managers and hire better lower level employees who thus are empowered to make manager type decisions. Thus, when we look at organizational charts here, let's look at structures. Usually you'll see that organizational charts are either tall or flat. A tall organizational structure is one in which the organizational chart would be tall because there are various levels of management, as you know, as bureaucracy. In a flat organizational structure, has few, if any, layers of management or just one layer of management, and thus a much more broad span of control. So where a tall organizational structure has many managers, flat organizational structure has a broad span of control. Let's look at an example of a flat organizational structure on the next slide. This is an example of a flat organizational structure. I would gather that this is maybe a sole proprietorship that has just one owner who also manages the business, and he or she here has a span of control of 6 non-managers who report directly to the owner/manager. The book points out advantages and disadvantages of different spans of control. And I'd like you to go back in your book and to read some of those. For the next several slides, we're going to talk about departmentalization. And simply put, departmentalization divides companies into separate units. We're going to look at 5 different types of departmentalization on the next couple of slides. But before we get to that, let's talk about advantages and disadvantages of departmentalization. First, the advantages. For one, employees develop skills and progress within a company as they master skills. So for instance, when you put someone in by their function, as you will find out, they get better, they move up to a higher level within that function. In addition, when you put people into departmentalization, usually the company can achieve more economies of scale because that person is doing something that they have an advantage in. Finally, an advantage of departmentalization is that employees can coordinate their work within the various functions for which they are departmentalized, and thus top management can better direct their activities. However, there are also disadvantages to departmentalization, as the slide points out. Probably the biggest disadvantage to departmentalization is that the various departments don't communicate well, if at all. Oftentimes, these departments are insular and they only talk within the department. And thus, employees within one department may identify with their own department goals rather than with the overall goals of the organization. Because people are specialized within one department, they tend to not become experts in other departments within the organization, and thus may engage in groupthink and other things that may be detrimental to the organization. So the next several slides, we're going to look at different ways to departmentalize. The book puts out 5 different ways that we will talk about in the next 2 slides. The first 2 ways to departmentalize can be by product or by function, as you can see on the slide. The first way is by product. So for instance, looking at the slide here, one could probably deduce that this company is some sort of book company by look. The way they're doing it is by different products. So for instance, you can see you have certain people who work within the trade books. That's one product. Another product is college textbooks. And finally, the third product by which to departmentalize is by technical books. Probably the most popular way that companies departmentalize can be shown by the second way, which is by function. So for instance, looking at the slide here near the bottom, you can see that this company is departmentalized by the various functions that it does, whether it's finance, accounting, human resources, production, marketing, information technology, etc. Other ways to departmentalize can be by customer group. Different companies may have various customers that they serve. So for instance, looking at the top part of this slide, this company has decided to departmentalize based on its various different customers. Individual consumers, for instance, or commercial users, or institutions. Another popular way to departmentalize can be by geographic location. So for instance, you can look here that this company has domestic operations, but it also has international operations because it's departmentalized, at least from an international perspective, by divisions. You can see one for Canada, Europe, Japan, etc. The final way to departmentalize can be by the processes it takes to take inputs into outputs. So looking at the bottom part of the slide, one may deduce that this company may produce certain types of clothing, because look at the different processes it takes. There are cutters, dyers, and stitchers who will probably take inputs in use these different processes to create the output of clothing. The following several slides will look at different ways to structure an organization. The first two ways we're going to look at is line and staff. After looking at those ways to structure an organization, we'll get into more complex methods such as matrix style and cross-functional self-managed teams. Let's start with line organizations. A line organization has direct two-way lines of responsibility as well as authority and communication that run from the top to the bottom, like our chain of command that we talked about earlier. In essence, everyone reports to one supervisor. If anyone's ever been in the military, you would definitely understand a line organization. Within a line organization, there are no specialists such as legal or accounting to give indirect advice to people. So managers of line organizations issue orders to people beneath them. In addition, they enforce discipline and adjust to changes within the organization. Line personnel are the workers responsible for directly achieving company goals and include such things as production and distribution and marketing. Please note the difference between line personnel and staff personnel. Staff personnel are employees such as attorneys and accountants who advise and assist line personnel, but they don't make actual decisions. The line personnel make the actual decisions. The staff personnel do not. So let's look at the following slide that will show the differences between a line organization and a line and staff organization. As you can see from the slide here, near the bottom here, where you see a solid line indicates a line organization. So looking at the slide, the workers who are in orange, the assembly line workers in orange, have a line directly report to their immediate supervisor. The supervisor reports directly to the plant manager, and the plant manager in a line organization reports directly to the chief executive officer. Notice, however, the dotted lines that are put in. This denotes staff organizations. So for instance, human resources, legal, accounting, or marketing and research, they have professionals in there who advise but do not have decision-making authority. So for instance, someone in human resources can advise either the chief executive officer or plant manager, but at the end of the day, it's either the plant manager or chief executive who has final decision-making authority. So that is a line organization and a line and staff organization. The third type of organization I'd like to look at is known as a matrix organization. In a matrix organization, we have specialists from different parts of the company and they work together, but notice on a temporary basis for specific projects, one-off projects, if you will, but they still remain part of a line and staff structure on a more permanent basis. The reason that we have matrix organizations is usually on such things as creativity, product development, or special one-off projects. The following slide will show an example organizational chart of a matrix organization. Notice in purple, we have employee A, who's a buyer. And if you look at the sample matrix organization, employee A in purple has a line authority to the vice president of manufacturing, denoted by the solid line. In addition here, employee A also has a one-off second boss with project manager 2 in light blue. In essence, employee A works for the vice president of manufacturing on a full-time basis, reports to that person, but for a special one-off project also reports to a second boss denoted by project manager 2. Let's look at some of the advantages of using a matrix style of organization. The biggest advantage is that managers have more flexibility in assigning people to projects. So you're not just working for one person, you can work on many things. In essence, it unlocks creativity so that people aren't always doing the same thing on the job and getting bored with their work. And thus, it can be oftentimes a more efficient use of organizational resources. However, there are disadvantages to the matrix style of organization. First and foremost, it's very costly and expensive, and oftentimes can be complex and confusing. Thus, as noted by the visual in the slide, you can tell that these employees oftentimes don't know to who their loyalty should go to, their full-time boss or manager, or their manager on their one-off or specialized project. Another disadvantage of the matrix style is that these teams are not permanent in terms of these special things. So you can go from one team to another team. The problem with a matrix style that's not permanent can somewhat be offset in our last type of organizational structure, which is known as a cross-functional self-managed team. Under this type of team, groups of employees from different departments who work together on a long-term and not a temporary basis. Thus, cross-functional self-managed teams are a way to fix the problem of short-term matrix-style teams to establish teams that stick together for the longer term. And thus, it empowers these teams to work closely together and thus form bonds and trust with each other. Notice that the employees are from not the same department, but from different departments so that they can collaborate more and you can bring in people with different ideas and different experiences. However, cross-functional self-managed teams also work best when you don't just bring in people from different departments within the organization, but bring in other stakeholders from outside the organization, such as customers or the government or suppliers. And thus you get a holistic approach to trying to figure out what's the best product or what's the best service to provide your customers from a lot of different perspectives. So it's nice to work, in teams to do things, but, teams can be inside the company and they can also be outside the company. So beyond cross-functional self-managed teams, more organizations are using such things as networking in order to make better products and services. Under the notion of networking is the idea that organizations are using communications technology to link other organizations in an effort to work together seamlessly and often in real time or actual moments. So an example of this would be, ahead of a natural disaster, Home Depot may oftentimes be able to, in real time, utilize its network to get a hold of a lot of its lumber suppliers to make sure that an adequate amount of lumber or other types of materials are in its stores near a hurricane area, because those items will be in big demand prior to the landfall of a hurricane. So what you're seeing with many organizations is the notion of transparency. And we talked about transparency in a previous company. Transparency notices that when a company or organization is so open to its other companies that electronic information or any analytical information is shared as if the companies were in fact together or merged together. In essence, oftentimes the result of transparency is a notion of a virtual corporation. And a virtual corporation is a network, oftentimes temporary in nature, made up of replaceable companies or organizations that join or leave as needed. This slide gives an example of a virtual corporation, and you can see that oftentimes a major motion picture can be a virtual corporation because there are many aspects that need to be done in order to get a film from pre-production to production, to distribution, to advertising, and other aspects post-production as well. And the idea is when parts of other organizations are needed, they can join the virtual corporation, and when they are no longer needed, they can exit just as smoothly. Other ways that companies can organize is by looking at the best practices of other corporations in similar industries. This can be done through such ways as benchmarking and core competencies. With benchmarking, a company compares its company's practices against the world's best. So don't think for a minute that Apple and Samsung, the world's biggest manufacturers of cell phones, don't benchmark each other. So when Apple comes out with the new iPhone 11, first thing Samsung does is buy it and take it apart and look at what parts and components are in there in an effort so that when they make their new Galaxy phone, that their phone then is up to par with the Apple phone and vice versa. Another way that organizations are designed to compete is through the notion of core competencies. With core competencies are the functions that a company can do as well or better than any other organization in the world. You're all familiar with Nike, and Nike, as you know, makes great shoes, but they don't really make the shoes. Most people think they make the shoes. They don't make the shoes. They design and they market the shoes. However, their core competency isn't in manufacturing. They outsource that manufacturing to other companies who can, through their factors of production, make those shoes at a lower cost. So speaking of outsourcing, we've talked about this several times over the course of this over this course. You can see that manufacturing oftentimes is the jobs that are most likely outsourced and usually offshore outsourced to other companies. However, you're seeing with the rise of robots, more services being outsourced as well. A common theme throughout today's lecture has been the notion of change. And for everyone, change isn't easy. We like to do things a certain way, and when we are asked to do something a different way, we are very resistant to change, whether that's in your personal life or whether that's in your work life. I mean, if you look at the example on the screen, if it was 100 years ago, we used a typewriter. Could you imagine a typewriter today in modern business? Obviously not. But companies that are slow to adapt to change, whether technological or other changes, cultural changes, sociological changes, etc., often are the ones that aren't around much longer. Oftentimes, now the change in today's business environment is informational in nature, otherwise analytical. So for instance, as you can see, Amazon.com, which is one of the biggest companies in the world and by far the biggest retailer in the world, uses information that's stored within its databases to reach out to its customers. And have you ever noticed that when you're on Amazon, they often advertise products that you have either previously purchased or previously looked at. In fact, Amazon has gone so smart, it knows your daily buying habits. So for instance, if you happen to purchase such things as cosmetics or home healthcare products on the weekends, they know to market those products to you on a Friday or a Saturday as opposed to a Tuesday or a Wednesday. And this all really goes to you people who really, the young people who are now known as digital natives. And these are, you guys who have actually grown up using the internet and social networking and thus are used to faster changes than many older people who are sometimes resistant to change because they didn't grow up in the internet movement. But companies oftentimes realize they have to change, and when they change, they oftentimes have to go through a process of restructuring, Restructuring is redesigning a company so it can either more effectively or efficiently serve its customers. You can see that banks have restructured, for instance, by relying less on tellers and relying more on online banking or use of the ATM machine. Restructuring can often be painful, and it oftentimes has resulted with a loss of jobs for people as more jobs are replaced by either technology or robotics. A more novel way to restructure is to go from our typical top-down pyramid here to what's known as what's called an inverted organization. With an inverted organization, this is a company that has contact people at the top, and actually the top management, such as the CEO and the CFO, at the bottom of the organizational chart. And the notion behind an inverted organization is that the people at the top should work for the people who are actually have the day-to-day contact. So for example of an inverted organization, as you can see here on the left is your traditional organization with top management at the top, where you can see as you move over to the right of the slide here, top management is at the bottom, and at the top is the frontline workers who have been empowered to work with teams. And thus, they're the ones who make the actual decisions with regards to the customers who bring in the revenue for the organization. We haven't seen too many inverted organizations because top management is resistant to change where they give up all the power. Another way to look at organizations is not necessarily through traditional things such as organizational charts, but to look at the underlying culture of the company or organization. Organizational culture generally is shared values within the organization, and hopefully these shared values will foster unity and cooperation to achieve common goals. And oftentimes some of the best companies or organizations are the ones who rally behind a particular cause or goal, and the idea is that they are more spirited and they take their job, they like what they're doing, and thus not only do they benefit individually, but the company benefits from those synergies. Oftentimes these types of cultures are shown through traditions that are passed down from basically from generation to generation. One of the final things we want to talk about today is the difference between formal and informal organizations. Formal organizations, all organizations have some level of formality to it. Formal organizations detail the lines of responsibility, authority, and position, much as we talked about with the hierarchy shown through the chain of command and visually represented through an organizational chart. And as you know, because of bureaucracy, formal organizations often are slow and thus take time for decisions to be made. And because of this time lapse, oftentimes they lose customers or lose ideas. We're starting to see more of an informal organization pop up. Informal organizations are really more systems of relationships that don't develop through line charts and organizational charts, but rather develop spontaneously as employees meet and form relationships. And if you look at the picture that accompanies this slide, you can look at this as an example of an informal organization. Notice there aren't cubicles that separate people here, but rather there's openness here. There's circles here which allow people to come together and congregate here. If you notice, the windows are open in terms of there's no shutters there. It's open. There's light that comes in. Notice that a lot of the plants there are not your traditional plants, but are like such things as cactus. They need, you can look at that as the symbolic of that you don't need a lot for something to grow, and they grow up together. And so you can see people are happy to be there. The dress code is informal. And if you notice that people are encouraged to work together as opposed to barriers such as corner offices or such things as cubicles, which would lead to barriers from people from getting together. So informal organizations like the one that you can see here on this slide foster such things as teamwork and camaraderie, which is nice because when you like the people you are working with, you oftentimes get better results. However, there are limitations on informal organizations. Often, criticisms of informal organizations is that this type of system is too unstructured and too emotional and can often lead to gossip and can lead to not the actual productivity going down within the organization because people are too often trying to build friendships and relationships as opposed to trying to get the work done. Final thing I want to talk about today is the notion within norms. And this is an example of things that are done informally that may not be codified like Henry Fail or Max Weber, but the idea is that everyone in the group should know what to do here. And this should go not only with whether you are in an organization for work, but within your everyday life. So, obviously be clean, don't tell off-color jokes, do not use profanity. And the bottom line is respect your fellow employees, whether they work above you or below you, just like you would respect all your friends who are outside the work environment. This concludes our lecture on Chapter 8, Structuring Organizations for Today's Challenges.